Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on December 8th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Getting to Know the New Homepage and Person page on FamilySearch.org. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on how do you know if your genealogy is correct. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James has over 40 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 18 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And if James is ready, we'll turn the time over to him.
Okay, and then I will share my screen. Okay, So we're going to talk today about how do you know if your genealogy is correct? And I'm sure this is a question that many people have come to as they look at the various family trees online. And if you have any kind of perspective about your own work, you probably from time to time wonder if what you're doing is correct. And so we really kind of need an idea of how we measure correctness in genealogy. And for that reason, we look at a lot of different factors. And so we'll get right into that. First, let me just kind of mention what I mean by correctness, and that is I was looking at a family tree entry on the Family Search family tree, and there were a couple, and they were married in 1758. Only the place they said they were married was in Kentucky. A quick look online will show you that the earliest European place, in habitation, settlement or whatever in Kentucky was in about 1768, 1780, up to 1780. There were some explorers, but there were not people getting married in Kentucky back in that time period. So those are the kinds of things that can happen if you're simply assuming that a place exists before it actually does exist, or if you're assuming that somebody could be married in a place that did not exist geographically at the time, then yes, that would obviously not be correct. The answer to that is that the date may be correct, but the place would probably be Virginia, because Kentucky was a part of Virginia. So if you'd said they were married in that date in Virginia, you would have been correct no matter where they were, if they had been married over in Virginia or in what was then Kentucky. Not likely, however, that actually happened. Okay, well, we're going to get into it. And first of all, we need a couple of definitions. And so we're going to ask those questions. And the first one is, what do we mean by being correct? And what does that actually mean when we're talking about genealogical research? And a genealogical entry is correct when it's essentially consistent with the available contemporary historical source documents. Okay, so let's kind of dissect that. So when you put something into a family tree or into your own pedigree or family group record or wherever you're entering your information, and the concept here as that information about a particular event in an ancestor's life has to be supported by some kind of an historical record that is contemporary with the actual event. So if you're looking for a marriage in 1850, then you have to have a document that's some time around 1850 that records that marriage. If you don't have the marriage record, then you could say, well, I calculated the marriage from the birth of the first child. And there's other things like that. But those kind of general rules of genealogy are the things that that you sort of learn about as you become more and more involved. But in the kind of the absolute idea of creating a viable and understandable framework for genealogy is that we rely on contemporary documents, meaning documents created at or about the time of the event. And so we need a further definition, because we need to know that a genealogically significant historical document is one that contains contemporary information about an individual or family. So let's kind of contrast a few different things. Let's suppose there is a book that's written many years after the family has died, and the family is contained as part of that book. Those could be a surname book or a story, a history book, or some other thing. Those records are not contemporary, and so they're not as genealogically significant as the record that was created at the time. And to get to that point, we need to understand how we work with these records. So a genealogist is the person who searches historical documents for information about individuals and families. And then the genealogist organizes, analyzes, and organizes the records and the information. And basically, we organize the information by putting people into family trees based on record sort the formats that we have today for recording families, basically pedigrees and family group records and other types of information. Now, what's happened with moving away from the paper documents that we used many years ago, but moving into what's online, then we're somewhat constrained by the structure of whoever created the documents. Some of us who go back to the old paper family group records certainly recall the fact that the space given for the names or the space given for the places was usually not adequate. Unless you wrote very, very small, you could not get a long place name or a long person's name into those fields. And then there was no adequate place to put all the sources. And if you have access to old family group records, you'll know that a lot of times the sources were typed on the back or written on the back of the family group record, because that was the only other place we had for recording that information. Fortunately, when we're talking about electronic recording, most of the fields in the electronic medium, like Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage, are large enough to contain even much more information than we would normally record. So that particular problem of the size of the space has been eliminated to some extent. But basically, the format, the way that the information is organized, is that a person has 2 parents and 4 grandparents. Now, what happens in the real world is that a person may have more than 2 parents. They could have adopted parents and biological parents, and they may even have had foster parents. So today's formats on most of the large websites are not adequate to show all the different kinds of relationships. And now we don't even have to get into questions about whether we can show relationships from other cultures and the way that people are related due to their cultural relationships. So that's kind of the challenge today in genealogy. But the whole purpose of being a genealogy is to is to work through those processes and really answer those questions to some extent, and think about the kind of things that we need to do. And of course, if we use the programs and all the different ways we can use different programs, we can certainly preserve and organize the information that we find. But the real activity of being a genealogist is the activity of finding genealogically significant documents, analyzing that information, and then recording it. And we need to record it in a way that enhances the abilities of others to view the documents in context. So that's kind of the advantage of the online family trees, is because there's a way to attach images of all the records that we refer to in the same area, so that anyone who needs to can go back, and then we link it back to the original source, so that if I click on a name in Family Search or in Ancestry, I can see a list of the sources, the documents that support the information that's there. And then I can see it in the context of that, of how that was obtained, by simply clicking on the source and or following the link of the source, assuming that it's been recorded properly. Now, all of this assumes that the genealogist is actually recording the information and is relying on historical sources for the information, and not simply making it up or doing whatever, following somebody who had it in a family group record or on a GEDCOM file that did not have any sources and did not say where the information came from. That's probably one of the major challenges of many of the old books written back in the time when people were compiling surname books were still being written, but the older materials, is there's often not complete documentation. But you always have to remember that the date of the document, because the information about people who were actually living at the time or almost contemporary, meaning their parents or grandparents, were probably known to the people writing the books, rather than 200 or 100 years later, when we're looking at the material and think that it's very old. So this is kind of the core work of being a genealogist, that is, grappling with the idea of finding all the documents. And the process that we go through in learning to be a genealogist and family historian is constant need to learn about more and more documents. I spend more time learning about documents than any other one activity, and searching through them once I find them. So it's just as the core project of what we do. And that mandates that we also are familiar with how the documents are stored, where they might be stored, and how to access those documents in the location where they may be, whether it be online in a program, on a website, or whether they're actually physically still in paper documents someplace around the world. So first of all, the genealogist needs to, once they find the historical document, they need to be able to record that. And the way that we do that is called a citation. And a citation is a formal, consistent way of identifying the document or record so that someone else can find the document. Now, just as a matter of interest, the main source for citation format, how we actually put down the citation on paper or online, is for genealogists has been traditionally the Chicago Manual of Style. So that's why that book's up here. Basically, if we follow the format of entering the information that is asked for by some of the different online programs, then that is sufficient. Basically, what we want to know is, where did you find it? where was that record located? And that means a lot of levels. In other words, not only where was what the actual record was, a marriage record from Connecticut in 1890, for example, but we should also know where that Connecticut record was located. And in our world of online computers, it's giving a link to the either the original record or at least the place where the record was, the website that the record was located on. The idea here is to have a path by which any successive person, anyone coming on and looking at the records that you're finding, will be able to, or citing and putting in as sources, will be able to look at that and go back and see if you somehow accurately copied from the original document, or if there was more information than you copied. And so this is the idea of having some kind of a consistent formal way of citing all of this information. And there's been whole books written about genealogical citations. So those are the kinds of things that if you get to a certain level, you need to worry about, particularly if you're into the publication type of, if you want to publish your information, you're going to, at that point, have to work with whoever the editor is of the people publishing the information, and they will tell you which format they want to use and how you would be presenting that format. But as far as those of us who are working online, we can use the forms that are inherent in Family Search and Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past, and all the other websites. But if we go out to other websites and we find additional information, then we need to extract the essence, the connections, the links, the descriptions that we need, so that those sources are, those records and documents are identified. In addition, genealogists can and should explain the thought process they use to conclude the reliability of the historical document or record. And you'll hear this over and over again, that you're supposed to cite your sources, but they'll also say give a reason statement. And the reason statement is why this document is correct and why you should rely on what I concluded about the individuals that are supposedly supported by this document. So basically what we have here is on most of the electronics, we have a way of giving a reason statement, explaining. It'll say, why did you choose this document? Why is it important? And it doesn't need to be elaborate. It just needs to give enough information that we can see if there was actually a thought process that we went through in order to have that information added to our family trees. Okay, so once we process the document, we refer to the document as a source. So that's just, it's sometimes confusing when we use a general term like sources. So on Family Search, for example, it's you have a list of your sources. Well, the list of the sources are the documents that you got the information from, and they are sources because you use the information from that document. So if we take the first entry here on this, where my grandfather was in the household of his father, my great-grandfather, in the 1900 census, that means that I looked at the 1900 census. I took the information that was there, and I turned it into, and I used it in my family tree in some way. And then I also put a source citation in here to indicate that that's where that particular piece of information was located. And the reason that's there is so that we can determine the accuracy or validity of the genealogist's opinion. And sometimes we talk in terms, kind of a legalistic way of looking at genealogy is to talk in terms of evidence and proof and all of these kinds of things. Well, you don't really prove anything in genealogy, and you don't really have evidence. Evidence is something it's considered when you have a third party who will determine whether or not what you have is valid. If you're determining yourself, then it's not in the evidence. It's basically an opinion. It's something that a conclusion that you've come to, that this is valid and this is correct. And we just need to know where you got the information so that we can go back and determine whether or not you've actually made the correct evaluation of that person, of that particular piece of information. So a definition of a source is a statement that's usually written that identifies the exact location where genealogical or historical information was found, thus enabling future research to validate the original research and conclusions. Okay, so we're going to kind of dissect that a little bit with an example. Let's say that I have been taught in my high school years to go out and have note cards or keep a source or tell what the source is. And so I say, this particular piece of information, my information that I'm using, which I'll say is the name of this person in my family tree. His name is Tom Jones. Let's say that, just make up a name. And I say, I got it out of this book. And I say, this is the book, History of one of the counties, let's say in Arizona, history of Maricopa County, Arizona. Well, okay, you've told me that. And if you're thinking in terms of, well, that's the source, you got it from this book, History of whatever by the such and such author and whatever. Now, but that didn't tell me where you got the information. It tells me you got it out of a book, but we don't know where you got the book. So if I were going to have to verify whether or not that information was correct, or I wanted to look at additional information that may be in that same book, then I don't know where the book is. I don't know where you looked at it. And so basically what we're trying to do and understand when we're sourcing or giving a source is giving people a path that they can go directly to it. Now, if it was a digital book and you had the link to it, then that would be you'd go right to the page, for example, if that was one way you could do it in the book. But if you're talking about a book that you looked at in a library, then you usually have to say accessed on a certain day, in a certain place, and then that would tell me that I had to go to the University of Arizona library, or I had to go to the Historical Society, Arizona State Historical Society, or someplace to find that particular item. And so what we're doing here is trying to communicate so that our communication of where we got this information is sufficient that I can go to that location without me having to redo all of the research that you have already done. We're just trying to make sure that we build on each other's research rather than every time I go to an entry in a family search, for example, that I am required to go back and find all the sources to see if it's correct or not. And that's kind of this idea of working with sources. Now, for your own purposes, let's assume that you're saying, well, I'm not going to publish it, and I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that with the information. But for your own purposes, if you don't record exactly where you got the information, you're not going to remember that. And if you come back to it a year or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years later, You may have to do the research all over again because now you still don't know where you got it. Because when you recorded it, you didn't record enough information for us to find the original the original book. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Let's go a little bit farther. Now, when we talk about original, we mean documents that were created at or near the time of an event in our ancestors' lives. And they were created by someone who was either there and witnessed the event, or they had a duty to report the event. Now, what's the difference between being a witness and having a duty? A witness would be someone actually who was there and recorded it or had firsthand knowledge of it. And the second person, and the person who had the duty, could be some kind of county official, someone who had a duty to record that information and record it correctly. So that's how we get over this part. Let's talk about a death certificate. A death certificate, and if you go through the process of looking at death certificates, they're, by the way, rather recent documents. It's on the earliest death certificates you're ever going to find in the United States are in the mid to late 1800s. Very, very few before 1880 in that kind of range for most of the states in the United States. So what we're looking at is a document that sometimes created at a time other than the time that the person died, and that there's record information on there, such as the burial and a signature by the doctor. The doctor's signature may be on that 2 or 3 or 4 days later. However, all of these people that are involved had a specific legal duty in the United States to report that information, and as accurately as possible. So we still consider that, even though there are some parts of it which, in a legal sense, would be hearsay or secondary information. It's always accepted that legal documents like that have validity, even if they were created at a time distant from the actual time of the event. So that's where the duty to report the event comes in. The duty part of it gives us some assurance that the information is correct. And so that's where we get to that. And this means that everything else is secondary. All the other records about people are secondary records. If I find a letter written by my ancestor and it's written in his or her handwriting, and it tells what they did at a certain event, and that their baby was born or their son or daughter got married or whatever, those obviously those are what we call primary or original documents. If I come on a letter that says, well, Uncle Tom told me that they got married on the 2nd of May and they had their first child the following year. Well, okay, it's a valid source. It's a validly type of information that would be included in anyone's family history. But we need to recognize that perhaps we would like to have an additional record or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever that would substantiate and make that information more reliable in a sense. So what we're doing here is attempting to create a web of documents that are mutually supportive of the information that they contain. So we're not building on information that may have been incorrect at the time. And I'm speaking not from standing up on some big hill telling everybody about this type of issue, because I've been the last couple of weeks, I've been through a situation where I was relying on in English research over in England on the British census records, and I was relying on the fact that the person that I was looking for had a wife with a certain name, and then I recorded that information and I put as a source the census record. I found another record with that person and the same wife, or my assumption was the same, and on and on. And I got through and I had a whole thing. And the guy had lived to be 107 years old. Well, I mean, that does happen. But as it turned out, as I got back into it, they weren't all the same person. And what I had done is I had picked up someone who had the same, two men who had the same name, who married wives with the same name. And to add more difficulty, they lived next door to each other. And so we needed to go to additional documents in order to start to differentiate between the two. And it turned out that both of them were fairly reasonable and all the children worked out. But that's not something that just comes because of copying information without thinking about it. So accuracy and persistence are essential to making any progress. You just really need to be sort of, I would say, consumed with the idea that the records, that what you are trying to do is be accurate. And the unfortunate part of all this is, of course, the records that you're relying on aren't always accurate. They're tremendously, they could be tremendously off. I had an ancestor who was married, and it was pretty obvious that on the marriage certificate, there's no marriage certificate, but the record of the marriage, that the wife's age, she had basically represented as being 20 years younger than she actually was. So, there's lots of different kinds of records out there that may or may not be reliable. And so when we start relying on one instance or one record without working past that to all of the available records that may be available, then we are sort of locking ourselves into decisions that may be based on weak or faulty information. So that's kind of the goal, is to work through its persistence. So when you enter information about one of your family members in a public and or private family tree, it's possible that someone's going to look at that entry and decide whether or not they agree or not. And this is kind of the part that I think that makes it difficult for some people to be involved in genealogy, because they think that what they have is private. I'm not going to let them, or it's my work and I don't want anybody to see it. But the basic problem that you do when you think about that is the standard geometric progression of people's lives. They have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. Those are the numbers of your grandparents. And how many of those people had children? Well, they obviously had enough children that you're still alive, but they also had children that are your relatives. Now, your cousins is the term that we used of all these people who are your cousins. And they're looking at exactly the same tree. It wouldn't matter if your tree was on Ancestry and you were keeping it totally private. Someone else is looking at exactly the same family tree, minus maybe 1 generation or 2 or 3 generations at the most. And so there's really, when you get down and start to understand that idea, you begin to see the necessity of communicating, even if the person isn't physically there or hasn't, you don't know they exist, that you physically communicate how you obtained the information, where you got the information, and how you came to the conclusion that it was correct. So if you have that kind of background, then there's no, let's call it, a fear of anybody else coming in and saying, well, you did this all wrong. And hopefully at an early date, somebody would come in and tell me I did it all wrong, because I have over the years met quite a few people who started out doing their family history based on family tradition or whatever, and ended up finding out that that was not actually their family. And that was nice. They probably did a lot of work for somebody, but it didn't help them in understanding or having their own family. So basically, if your original sources are going to tell people where you got the, if you have that source information, then your people are more likely to agree with you than they are not to agree with you. And that comes down to another issue, which is the fact that we need to have that a high percentage of the entries in a lot of the family trees, and very common when I see people starting out, but I also see it when people have extensive genealogies, that the entries only have one citation, or they have no citations to any of the sources where the information was obtained. So the question is, why are all those names there? Well, somebody either traditionally in their family or simply found some information and failed to record the source where they got it, where it came from. If they copied it out of a book, or they copied it out of off somebody else's information. It was interesting as back at when the family tree on Family Search Family Tree began, very originally, very new. It was very, very obvious that to me that my information that I had put in initially was being copied and copied. And why was that correct? Because it was wrong. It was inaccurate. I had made mistakes. And so I could see that people were making the same mistakes. One example of that was my great-grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner, was constantly recorded as being born in San Bernardino County, California. And when he was born, there was no San Bernardino County. He was actually born in Los Angeles County. But I could easily tell that my information had been copied because I made the mistake initially of recording San Bernardino County. And when I changed it to Los Angeles County, no one had made the changes. So as I ran across that for a long time, for many years, now because of the unified family tree, that information is pretty well been corrected. And you don't see so many instances of that anymore. So when we're talking about the degree of accuracy or reliability, it's related to the cited sources. In other words, unless you actually tell me where you got the information and how you arrived at your conclusion, in a sense, is I don't have to believe anything you say. And it basically, without a cited source, it's ipso facto, meaning from the beginning or completely unreliable and unquestionable. So people wonder sometimes why in a collaborative family tree like the Family Search Family Tree, why the information changes. Well, it changes because the information does not have a lot of sources. Now, even if it has a lot of sources, there's a tendency for some changes to occur. And that is basically because it can, not because it needs to. And the people who try to make the sources should always come in with reliable contemporary historical sources to support their changes. Unfortunately, that information has not been totally accepted by all of the people who are participants in the family tree or in other family trees. I have, and I sound like I'm picking on the Family Search Family Tree, but I can open up an Ancestry, and within a very few minutes of my looking at anyone, I will see some record hints from Ancestry. But part of those record hints will be people with other family trees with that same individual in their family tree. And it's very quickly that I will see that the majority of those, or nearly all of those, will come up without any sources. And it's in Ancestry where they supply you the sources. And all you would have to do is click and link it to your family tree. So that's kind of the issues that are background to talking about this subject. And you can go into some entries in online trees and you'll see a long list of sources, or you'll see lists of sources in the back of a book, or many other places where people have said, this is all the stuff we looked at. The problem, what it comes out to be, the problem is that the records just don't happen to contain any information about a specific individual's entry. And that can be crucial when we're talking about showing a parent-child relationship. So if I say that John Jones is the son of Tom Jones, then I need to have a document that is a reliable contemporary document that is confirmed by other documents that this person, this parent is the parent of this child, or the child is the child of this parent. Without that, it doesn't matter how many other sources you have attached, you cannot go back that next generation. Now, does that stop people from adding generations? No, hardly does. But it's easy for anyone who is looking at it critically to go through and look at each of the generation steps in a family tree and say whether or not there is a document or documents that support a parent-child relationship to move that family link back one more generation. So without that support, you really have no way to add parents. Now, that doesn't stop people from adding records all the way back to Adam, but on the other hand, when you go in and realistically look at that connections do not exist because there's no parent-child relationship. A marriage record that shows that the father and mother were married does not tell you if they had a child, the specific child who they may have listed as their child. And so this is kind of the total idea here. Sorry. So if you're working online on a family tree, then you really need to be prepared for changes. There's going to be changes. It doesn't matter if you're working on the family search family tree or on Ancestry or MyHeritage or whatever. You're going to find that there are differences between your tree or your viewpoint and the viewpoint of those around you. Now, you can ignore that. That's one reaction to it. You could just say, well, I don't care, and I don't care what they all think, and I'm right, and no one can tell me I'm wrong. But on the other hand, what's going to happen is that you're going to die. Let's just put it into blunt format. And whatever you thought is simply not going to be taken as fact unless you do follow the specific pattern here. That is, that each time you enter a person's name, that you have a valid, supportable historical source, and you show a parent-child relationship. And so over time, meaning longer than a few months or a few years, that over a long period of time, a lot of this information begins to be corrected. Now, I'm the process, for example, of working with documents that were collected from the 1600s, and some of the information that's been traditionally handed down has turned out to be not correct. Getting rid of that information will probably take another generation or more of people saying, wait a minute, there isn't any support for that conclusion that you have that of the origin of this particular person. So that's kind of the thing that they're working through. And we always have to remember that the information that we're looking at is only as reliable as the source, the author's or the source of the authors or the authors have cited. So, for example, if there was a mistake in the spelling, if there was a mistake in the birth date, if there was a mistake in any of that information, or a deliberate misrepresentation. I mean, there's some records, for example, that are inherently unreliable for the date of birth and the age of people. For example, draft registration records. There's a great incentive either to say you're older than you are in order to get into the Army and Navy, whatever, or to tell that you are younger than you are, so that you're no longer you won't be drafted. So relying on some kinds of information always has some kind of an inherent degree of unreliability. And so that's another reason why we go into the situation of having a lot of different sources, is extending as much as possible. I have people who say, well, I've cited the census, and I said, well, have you cited census records for every single member of the family through every year that the census existed during their lifetime? And they go, why would I do that? The answer is because one census may be wrong, 5 censuses might be wrong. They may, but as you examine them all, they sort of drift towards the information that is correct. And I've seen that happen many, many times. So people who misrepresented their age when they got married because they wanted to get married, they were underage and they wanted to get married and they got married. And then in subsequent records, the information about their actual age comes out, and when they're given a different set of circumstances, they may even come up with a different age. So I've seen people who reported the wrong age in every single census. So, or a different age. We don't know. But then we could take all of those, look at when the children were born, look at their ages when they were supposedly married, and all of this other information, and then we can sort out and say, well, they were born about, or they were married about a certain date, because now we know the range. And that's why we have estimates in there, because there is always a degree of difference and unreliability out there. So let's go back just a second to review, and that discovering genealogically relevant documents is the initial and most time-consuming part of genealogical research. So finding these documents is entering the information is, like clerical work. You just do it. It's obvious that the records, once or documents are finally discovered, they need to be searched. And I deal with telling people, for example, that here's this parish register that has potentially has your person's birth date. And do you have any idea when the date was? Well, no, I have a range, 1830 to 1860. Oh, great. Okay, so if you want to find it in this record, then you're going to have to search through this record from 1830 to 1860 on every page until you find where your ancestor was born. Well, obviously, people are not exactly ecstatic to find that out, and that it might be very difficult. And that's the answer. The answer is yes. And that's basically what we do as genealogists is more than we would like. We end up searching page by page and document by document. Now, with indexes and finding aids and electronics today, we certainly have the way to discover more documents without that possibility, but it's still the basic way that we approach and look for the documents. So I would say that it is unwise to rely solely on online resources. So there's a lot of information online, but there's still a vast number of records waiting to be digitized, indexed, and cataloged. The historical images on Family Search is a prime example. Those are records that, for the most part, are not cataloged and not indexed. And if you're not aware of this particular source of records on Family Search, then click on the search tab and go to historical images and start putting in the place names, and you'll find out how many additional records there are that are not indexed and would have to be searched page by page. So this is sort of the kind of how this whole process works. So we look for documents, we find the documents, or we go through page by page, or we look at an index and then we go. So just recently there was a question about, well, I have the indexed records, so why do I need to look at the original? Well, many times, like the one example that I've already given, is that by looking at just the index, which was what I was being supplied by Ancestry, I was entirely wrong. I entered it in three people actually, it ended up being, who had the same name and the same wives' names. And I had to spend about 2 weeks off and on looking at more and more records until I finally was able to separate out the three families. So this is kind of the basis for everything. And if you don't understand this, this is a very important thing, is the indexes are not, they're indexes. They are selections of items that someone called an indexer has made about that particular document. They don't contain all the information. They're not like a Google search searching every word. They are a selective list of things. And whether you're going into, and even Google, by the way, ultimately is just a huge index. So we really need to understand that. And I have the good example I have is when I was working as a bibliographer at the University of Utah Library and had to do a report on Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo, and went to the card catalog, the index, and found the records. But I knew through my activities in the library, basically what I call walking the shelves, that there were other records available. And I found 2 other sets of records in the library, none of which were indexed or mentioned in the card catalog. So if you relied on that index, you would simply have missed a number of other records about the same source. And that's sort of the thing that's been repeated time after time after time as I've been doing research over the years. And it's still happening, just as I just illustrated with the history about the people in England. And then what happens when they contradict each other? Well, that's going to happen. And then it's up to us to make an evaluation. And usually, if you find contradictory sources, that just means you need to look more places. You need to be more, your research needs to continue and look for additional places of where the information could have been kept. And then you'll find that it may not really be contradictory. And in the sense that I was working, it turned out that they weren't even the same people, that I was talking about 2 people. And obviously, some of the information about the 2 people would be contradictory. So here's kind of the flow. First of all, you've got to be educated and start planning to do this. And then you go through a discovery stage where you're learning that where the records exist and how to extract the information and how to record it. And then you get into evaluation, which is a completely different process. You need to know whether this information is believable or not. And then we review it periodically because we have to go back through and look to see what we did originally. And we do end up revising the information that we had original. And we go through, as we go through this, it's been depicted as a circle, the circle of research or whatever, but it's really more lineal because I don't ever go back to the beginning of learning about the family. Once I had all that information, I really keep progressing. So it's more like a head over heels kind of process instead of an actual just coming back to the same place you were originally. And so you should always be ready to make corrections. There's always space for additional information that may change some of the fundamental information that you found. About my own parents, for example, we're now going through letters and things that I did not have access to when they were alive. And so obviously I'm finding out dates and times and things that happened that I was entirely unaware of as a child. So we really need to keep learning. We need to keep going back and getting back into the fundamentals of understanding where these records are, how they are handled. This is especially true as we work into a new language or into a different part of the world that we're not familiar with. And so these are the kinds of things that make genealogy interesting, challenging. And as I always say, the only reason that I'm still interested after these many years is because it's so hard, it's so difficult, and it requires so much energy in order to actually find the information. Okay, well, thanks for watching. And any questions? Anybody have while we were? Do I need to list a source if it's more than once, like family search and ancestry? Okay, let's go back to the definition. Definition is where you got it. If you got it in two different places, you record both places. That helps us know that I can go to Ancestry and Family Search to look for a 1900 census. And it's not, there's none of this tidying up or oh, we're just going to take up space with that. No, it's not like paper electronics doesn't take up space. So basically we just have that ability. Now, if we were in the old days and we were piling up paper, maybe we would make a different decision, but that's not what we do today. A small portion, I would say a substantial portion of the records on Ancestry originated on Family Search. And they both have the same information and they may both feed from the same place, and that's possible. And you just have to make that judgment. But generally speaking, if I run across the same information in other sources, meaning other locations, other websites or books or whatever, I want to have 5 sources for why the person was born on a certain date, or 10 or 15 or 20, because then the further I go down that road, the less controversy there's going to possibly be. Both Ancestry Search use each other's databases. Yes, they do to some extent. But on the other hand, there is a lot of information on both that's not on either. In other words, Family Search has unique information, Ancestry has unique, and so forth, and all the other websites do too. Okay, anything else?
Alan asks, do you disinherit relationships if there are no sources or documents?
On occasion, the answer is yes. I have that line that goes back that I mentioned to people who were born before Kentucky existed. I can't take them out if I don't have additional information. In other words, someone put them there and thought that they were the parents. So whether they got the dates wrong and whether it was not historical is an entirely different issue. I would remove it once I have determined that there aren't any records that show that information as being correct. That's pretty hard to prove a negative. So, or to show a negative. So if there are sources, it basically what it does is it creates a big question mark right at that point. And if I want to, I may spend some time trying to extend the line and see if that information is correct. There should be, in other words, if those names are correct, there should be somebody out there with that name on a land or a property or a probate or some other kind of record. And if they're not, if all the work I do does not determine that, then yes, I will take it off. One case, for example, is one line that I have done that with. It turns out that there are 10 people in that area where the last person on the line lives with exactly the same name and with similar wives' names. And finding out which one is which has not been possible with the records that are existent so far, or that I've found. So yeah, the answer is yeah, I would do that on occasion, especially if it's just blatantly false. Like, for example, Mayflower passenger. Mayflower passengers have been researched now for well over 100 years. All of the information and all of the sources that are reliable have been recorded and are available from the Mayflower Society. And those who do not have parents do not have discoverable parents. If anybody discovered the parents, they would have a long, hard road to first of all, convince the rest of the Mayflower people that you are correct. And secondly, to have sufficient information to persuade anybody that you are correct. Okay, those are the kinds of things that do happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on December 8th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Getting to Know the New Homepage and Person Page on FamilySearch.org. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.